TSA Oxford 2020, question 39. This is a applying principles question, right? That's where it asks you which one of the following illustrates the principle underlying the above argument. A principle is a general recommendation. So it's a general recommendation which a passage could apply to one specific example, which we'll read about in this passage here. But it's also a principle that can be applied to other situations as well. It's similar to a conclusion, but it's in some ways more general. So let's just remember that. A principle usually means general recommendation. Okay, so it's a general recommendation. So let's keep that in mind when we're reading this. If the captain of a national team commits any kind of crime, he or she is likely to be dropped, heavily fined by the sport's governing body, or barred from future competition. This is on top of any punishment handed down by the courts. Senior politicians, doctors, judges, or head teachers who offend often also find themselves barred from their professions, with little or no chance of regaining their hard-earned status after serving their sentence. There's nothing unjust in this, although it is effectively a double punishment for a single offense. That's interesting. Privileged people must understand that with rewards comes responsibilities, including the responsibility to behave in a more exemplary way than those in ordinary walks of life. That right there, this is sort of an argument here. There's nothing unjust in this. And it's concluding that privileged people must understand that with their privileges comes additional responsibility. And one of those main responsibilities is to behave in a more exemplary way, set an example for others, than those in ordinary walks of life. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, and I think this is a principle that we generally understand in our society. It's not something that's far-fetched. You and I can both relate to what the passage is attempting to argue. Okay, so which of the following illustrates the principle underlying the above argument? A crime is a crime, whoever commits it, and no exceptions should be made for highly placed people. Okay, well, it is this particular answer is sort of reflected in the passage, but that's not exactly the general principle that's underlying the argument. The argument is not that anybody should get off scot-free. The argument is that those in higher positions basically deserve double punishment, that they should be more careful, right? So we're not talking about who's getting away with crimes or exceptions. So highly placed people were not getting exceptions. If anything, they were getting double punished. So A is not really the right answer here. A police chief who accepts a bribe deserves more blame than the criminal who offers the bribe. Okay, that's interesting. This seems like the right answer because it's putting forth basically the same principle that the passage is trying to argue, right? It's saying that a police chief, somebody who has a very privileged position, like the politicians, doctors, judges, the captain of the national team that was mentioned above, someone like that who accepts a bribe deserves more blame than the criminal who offers the bribe. And that's saying here that the privileged person has a responsibility to behave in a more exemplary way than your ordinary criminal or your ordinary person. So this is interesting. We'll just keep that in mind for now. I just want to read the other principles to make sure that there's nothing that better illustrates the general principle underlying the argument. C says, leading sports personalities should understand that they are role models for young people. Okay, this captures the fact that privileged people should understand that they should, behave in a more exemplary way. But I don't think it captures the argument that they should be more exemplary than those in ordinary walks of life too well. So it's not really comparing, for example, that leading sports personalities should be better role models because there are others watching, or things like that. So I don't think C is describing it as good as B is. So I'm going to mark C off here. It is wrong to use the law to make an example of some people, but not others. Well, this is arguing that it's actually just to hand off a very strong punishment to certain people, the people in positions of privilege. That's what the entire first two sentences were arguing, or three sentences were arguing, saying that the captain of the national team would be made an example out of, right? He or she would be dropped, heavily fined, barred from future competition. So that's basically using the law to make an example of somebody, and the author of the passage seems to have no problem with that. So it's not D. People on low incomes who commit offenses should have reduced sentences. Okay, this is interesting. But again, in this case, the passage is really talking about how people in positions of responsibility have a greater responsibility to behave in an exemplary way. It's not saying that this is a free pass for less privileged people or less wealthy people to get away with crimes. So E is sort of extrapolating from the original argument, where just because we're saying that privileged people should behave in a more virtuous way, we're not saying less privileged people should behave in a less virtuous way. That is not what the passage is arguing. So E is not the answer. And I think we should conclude that B, a police chief who accepts a bribe deserves more blame than the criminal who offers the bribe, would be the best way to describe the underlying principle of this passage.